The girl who begged for death became the reason an immortal chose to fight for life. Elena's lungs filled with water the way a church fills with prayer, slowly, inevitably, with a terrible kind of peace. The river was black glass beneath the February moon, and the stones tied to her wrists were heavy with intention. She had written no farewell. There was no one left to read it. The villagers of Vidra had done their work efficiently. 3 days of whispers. A trial that lasted 1 hour. A priest who would not meet her eyes. They called her Vrajitoire, witch, because 8 children had died of scarlet fever in the winter, and Elena had tended to each one with her own hands, with poultices and prayers that failed. In a world desperate for answers, a woman without a husband and without children of her own became the perfect vessel for blame. She had not fought them. There was no fight left in Elena. There hadn't been since the night she miscarried at 28, alone in her cottage, bleeding onto white linen while her husband's absence felt like another kind of death. He had taken their daughter's memory and left. After that, every child she touched felt like an accusation. Every fevered forehead a mirror of her own sterile womb. The water closed over her face like a hand granting mercy. Then something else touched her. Not mercy, a grip. Ancient and electric, fingers wrapped around her arm, pulling her toward a surface she no longer wanted to reach. Elena thrashed, but the hands were patient, implacable. A man's voice, thin and desperate, cut through the water's roar. Not you! God, not you again! Her body broke the surface. Her lungs betrayed her with violent gasps. The cold air felt like betrayal itself. She was coughing, choking, her vision blurred by river spray and moonlight, and when her eyes cleared, she saw him. He rose from the water like something the river had birthed. Pale skin, luminous against the black current, dark hair clinging to his face, and eyes. God, his eyes. They were centuries old and drowning in a single moment of recognition so profound that Elena forgot to fear. Your cross, he whispered, and his hand trembled as it moved to the silver pendant at her throat. You're wearing her cross. I don't... Elena's voice fractured. She was shaking, unsure if it was cold or shock or the weight of his gaze. Who are you? Someone who has spent 378 years trying to forget the taste of guilt, he said, and his fingers traced the broken edges of the cross with infinite tenderness. And now you're going to let me try. He pulled her toward the rocks, toward the mouth of a cave where candlelight flickered like captured stars. Elena's wrists still ached where the stones had cut, and her mind spiraled with questions that felt less important than the single terrifying fact. She was alive. Someone had chosen to save her. In a world that had condemned her to death, someone had deemed her worth drowning for. Behind them, the river sang its ancient song. Inside the cave, the vampire would tell her everything, and Elena would learn that redemption tastes like blood and mercy, and that some eternities begin the moment you stop fighting to die. The cave was not a cave. It was a cathedral built into stone, pillars of earth reaching toward a ceiling lost in shadow. Candles, hundreds of them, burned in bronze holders, and their light moved across Victor's skin like something alive, like he was being perpetually consumed and reborn. Elena sat wrapped in furs before a fire that smelled of pine and something older, something that made her think of graves. Her dress clung to her body in heavy folds. Victor had left her alone to change into clothes that fit no woman, a poet's shirt, linen breeches, and she had obeyed without question. There was something about his voice that suggested obedience was not negotiable. He returned with tea that steamed silver in the firelight. His movements were fluid, practiced, the grace of someone who had learned to move through centuries the way others learn to walk. Drink, he said. It will warm you. Elena's hands shook as she took the cup. You know my cross. I knew the woman who wore it first. Victor sat across from her, and in the candlelight she could see the landscape of his face, not young, not old, but suspended in a beauty that transcended time. His eyes were the color of old bruises. Her name was Margaret. She was a healer like you. She found me in 1247, half mad with hunger, buried beneath the bodies of plague victims. Instead of driving a stake through my heart, she gave me her blood. She taught me that monsters are only monsters if they choose to be. You're saying you're 378 years old, he finished. A vampire, a creature that should not exist. A man who has broken every law of God and nature simply by continuing to breathe. He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something raw. And when I saw that cross around your neck, I remembered that Margaret had a daughter who was supposed to wear it, a daughter I was supposed to protect before the plague took everything. Elena set down the cup. Her mind was cataloging the evidence of madness, his own or hers, she couldn't decide. The children didn't die because of me. I know. Then why did you save me? Victor's jaw tightened. Because I have spent 3 centuries watching humans destroy what they fear. And I am tired. Because the river has drowned enough innocence. Because when I saw you sinking, weighted by stones and lies, I saw Margaret drowning all over again, and because... He stopped, as if the next words cost him something. Because I am not ready to let another woman die for sins she didn't commit. Outside, the wind began to move through the mountains, and it sounded like weeping. The villagers will come looking for me, Elena said. They will come, Victor agreed, and they will find only water. The river keeps its secrets here. The current runs deep, and the stones are patient. He stood and moved to a mirror, old silver, spotted with age, and touched his reflection as if to confirm his own existence. But you must decide something before dawn breaks. You can leave this cave and return to Vidra, tell them you survived, let them condemn you again, or praise God for your resurrection. Or you stay here, with me, and I teach you what it means to live forever with someone who remembers when you were supposed to die. He turned to face her, and his voice was barely a whisper. I can make you immortal, Elena. I can take the burden of your mortality and transform it into something that cannot be broken. You would never age, never sicken, never leave me the way Margaret did. Elena stood on unsteady legs. Her wrists throbbed, her lungs still tasted of river. And in the candle-lit shadow of this impossible man, she felt something she had not felt since before the miscarriage, the strange, terrifying sensation of being wanted, not as a healer, not as a woman who could give sons, but as herself, as Elena, as someone worth saving. If I say yes, she asked, do I have to drink your blood? Victor smiled, and it was the saddest thing she had ever seen. Not tonight, but eventually, yes. And when you do, you'll understand why I've been alone for so long. You'll understand that love, for creatures like me, is the most exquisite form of damnation. The fire crackled. Elena's shadow stretched across the stone walls, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not wish it away. The days in the cave became weeks, and weeks became the kind of timelessness that only grief and resurrection can create. Victor taught her the history of his hunger, not the hunger for blood, which he had mastered centuries ago through will and philosophy, but the hunger for connection, for touch, for someone to look at him without fear. Elena learned that he had been a physician in Prague before the plague took him, that he had a sister whose name he could no longer pronounce without pain, that he had watched the world transform from medieval stone to Renaissance art, and that he had wept the first time he saw a printed book. That loneliness, for an immortal, was not the absence of people, but the presence of too much time. In return, she told him about the miscarriage, about the way her blood had stained the linen in patterns that looked like accusations, about how her husband had left without ever saying goodbye, as if sterility was contagious, about the years of tending to other women's children while her own womb remained empty, and how that emptiness had slowly consumed her identity until she was not Elena anymore. She was only the space where a woman should be. "You were drowning long before the stones," Victor said one night as they sat by the fire. His hand was warm on hers, and his touch was careful, as if he was afraid she might dissolve. "Yes," Elena whispered, but at least the drowning was quiet. Victor stood and moved to a wooden chest carved with symbols Elena didn't recognize. From it, he withdrew a vial of dark liquid, not blood, but something that moved in the light like liquid shadow. "This is my blood," he said. "Not fresh, centuries old, concentrated." He held it up to the firelight. "If you drink this, you'll begin to transform. It will take 3 nights. On the 3rd night, you'll hunger for human blood, and I will have to teach you to hunt, to choose, to kill mercifully. But after that, Elena, you will be free. You will live as long as I do. The villagers can never touch you. Death can never touch you. Your womb will be sterile no longer because sterility won't matter. You'll have forever." Elena's throat constricted. "And what do you get?" Victor's voice cracked. "I get to not be alone. I get to love someone who won't leave me through the cruelty of aging. I get to believe, for maybe the first time since Margaret, that redemption isn't a lie I tell myself to sleep." He extended the vial. Elena took it with both hands. The glass was warm, and she could feel the pulse of something living inside it, not a heartbeat, but something older, something that had learned to survive outside of flesh. She uncorked it slowly, and the smell hit her first, copper and roses, earth and ancient rain. She drank. The pain was exquisite. It felt like every nerve in her body was burning from the inside, like her blood was learning a new language and her bones were being rewritten. She fell to her knees, and Victor caught her, holding her against his chest while her body convulsed. "I know," he whispered into her hair. "I know. Let it take you. Let the transformation have you. On the other side, Elena, there is light you've never imagined." By the 2nd night, her skin had begun to pale. By the 3rd, her eyes had turned the color of old bruises, Victor's color. And on the 4th dawn, when she woke, she felt the pull of it, the hunger, not for food, not for water, but for blood, for life, for the taste of another heart beating in her mouth. "What have I done?" she gasped. "What you chose," Victor said gently. "And now, my love, I have to teach you to live with it. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. The hunger was not like physical hunger. It was symphony and prayer and madness woven into a single, irresistible need. Elena's new eyes could see in darkness the way humans see in noon light, every shadow holding texture, every heartbeat audible through stone. When Victor led her to the mouth of the cave on the 4th night, she understood that the world she had known was only a sketch of the real one. The village of Vidra glowed below them like a lantern. She could hear them, every breath, every pulse, every secret carried in blood. "You'll hunt the guilty," Victor said as they stood at the cliff's edge. "Not the innocent, not the children, but those who have taken more than they needed, who have blood on their hands that is not their own." His grip on her shoulder was steady, anchoring. "The priest who condemned you, the mayor who cast the first stone, the healer's widow who whispered poison in the priest's ear. These are the ones who have earned what comes." Elena's body was vibrating with need. Her teeth had begun to elongate, and when she ran her tongue over them, she felt the points, not grotesque, but elegant, like the teeth of something that had evolved beyond human mercy. "I don't know if I can stop," she whispered. "You will," Victor said, "because I will be there. and because you are not a monster, Elena. You are a woman who has simply learned to bite back. They descended the mountainside in silence, moving through the darkness like wind, like thought. The forest knew them. The trees seemed to part, and the earth welcomed their footsteps. Elena felt the truth of immortality for the first time. It was not eternal life. It was eternal becoming. The body remembering it could be more than human, and the soul learning to accept it. The priest's cottage was dark. Victor moved to the window and inclined his head, and Elena understood. This one was hers. This man had held the cross while she was condemned. This man had prayed for her death. The window was open. The smell of him, fear already somehow, as if his body sensed what was coming, pulled at something primitive in her chest. She moved through the opening like water, and her new eyes found him in the darkness, sleeping, dreaming, innocent in the way that all creatures are innocent in their sleep. Elena stood over him, and for a moment she hesitated. This was the threshold. Cross it, and she would be damned forever. Don't cross it, and the hunger would consume her from the inside. He deserves it, Victor whispered from the window, but the choice is still yours. Elena opened her mouth. The hunger roared through her like a river, and when her teeth found his neck, she understood why Victor had been alone for so long. This was ecstasy. This was power. This was the first moment in her life that she had never been powerless. The priest's scream caught in his throat. His blood tasted of guilt and old sins, and Elena drank until his heart stuttered and stopped. She felt every moment of his fear transform into her strength, and she understood the terrible mathematics of immortality. Every life you took fed your own, and the weight of that consumption never, ever lessened. When it was done, she stood over his corpse, trembling. Victor pulled her out of the cottage and held her while she wept, not from guilt, but from the overwhelming realization of what she had become. A killer, a predator, a woman who would drink the lifeblood of others to sustain her own eternity. "The mayor's house is next," Victor said softly. "But not tonight. Tonight you grieve, and tomorrow night you hunt again. Because this is the cost of your salvation, my love. This is what mercy tastes like when it has teeth. In the village below, someone would find the priest's body by dawn. There would be whispers of plague, of God's judgment, of evil moving in the mountains. And Elena, high in the caves, would taste blood on her lips and understand that she had traded one kind of damnation for another. But at least this one she had chosen. Winter released the mountains slowly, and with it came the first real moment of peace that Elena had known. She and Victor had returned to the cave, and she had learned to hunt with precision, to choose her victims not from random cruelty, but from a strange, terrible justice. 3 more from the village, the mayor, the healer's widow, the magistrate who had called her witch. Each death was a mercy compared to what they had done to her, and each left her stronger, more rooted, more convinced that she had made the right choice. But something was changing in Victor. In the quiet nights by the fire, when they sat wrapped in furs and silence, Elena began to notice the tremor in his hands, the way he sometimes stared at his reflection in the silver mirror as if he didn't recognize himself, the way he had stopped speaking about the future and begun speaking only about the past. "What's happening to you?" she asked one night as she watched him stand motionless before the mirror for hours. "I'm remembering," Victor said quietly. "When you live long enough, Elena, memory becomes a kind of drowning. All the faces you've loved, all the cities you've watched burn, all the moments you chose to survive instead of choosing to end it." He turned to face her, and his eyes held the weight of centuries. "I thought you would save me from that. I thought that loving you, that making you immortal, that building this new world with you, I thought it would matter." "It does matter." Elena moved toward him, but he held up a hand. 378 years, he whispered. I've been trying to balance the scales of Margaretta's kindness against my own sins. I drank her blood to survive, and I've spent centuries trying to redeem that act by refusing to prey on innocence. But you, Elena, you've killed without hesitation. You've tasted power and found it sweet. And I realize now that I didn't save you from drowning. I taught you how to drown the world instead. Elena's new heart clenched. You're saying you regret turning me. I'm saying I'm tired, Victor said, and his voice cracked like old stone. I'm tired of the weight. I'm tired of the guilt. I'm tired of pretending that immortality is anything but a curse that we dress up as a gift. He reached for the broken cross around her neck, the one he had recognized, the one he claimed had belonged to Margaret. Take this off. It's yours now. Not a memory of her, but a memory of who you were before the hunger. Elena's hands trembled as she unfastened the chain. The cross fell into her palm, and in the candlelight she could see the fracture running through its center, not one clean break, but a spiderweb of cracks, as if it had been shattered and then carefully, lovingly put back together many times. It's been broken since 1247, Victor said, the year Margaret gave it to me. She said that something broken is sometimes stronger than something whole, because it's learned to hold itself together. He moved to the fire and reached into the flames, pulling out a piece of wood that was burning bright. She also said that every creature deserves the chance to choose their own ending. Elena understood then. She reached for his hand, stopping him before he could do what his eyes were already resolved to do. No, she said. Not yet. Not before we've lived. Not before we've found out if this thing between us, this hunger and love tangled together, can become something more than just survival. Victor looked at her for a long moment. You would keep me alive, even knowing what I am? Even knowing what we've become together? Because of what we are, Elena said. Because in a world that condemned me to death, you chose to drown with me instead. Because broken things understand each other better than whole ones ever could. She took the burning wood from his hand and threw it back into the fire. Then she kissed him, and his blood tasted like regret and hope, like centuries finally learning how to forgive themselves. Outside, the mountains watched in silence. Winter was ending. Spring was coming. And in the cave, two immortals had chosen, one more time, to live. Spring came to the Carpathians with a violence that seemed personal. Snow melted into torrents, and the river swelled until it sounded like it was singing prayers of resurrection. Elena and Victor emerged from the cave to find the forest transformed, birches pale against dark earth, wildflowers blooming in impossible colors, the air thick with the smell of rebirth. They walked the mountains together, and Elena found herself understanding the geography of Victor's loneliness. He showed her the monastery, where he had hidden in 1452, tended by monks who thought he was cursed. The battlefield, where he had watched thousands die from plague in a single summer. The ruins of the old Prague, where he had learned medicine and lost faith in the same year. Memory, he said, as they stood on a cliff overlooking Vidra, is what separates us from animals. But it's also what makes immortals into ghosts. We remember too much. We carry too many graves inside ourselves. Elena took his hand. His skin was cool, like stone, but his grip was warm. Then we remember together. That's how you stop being a ghost. Is it? Victor's smile was sad. Or do we just become two ghosts haunting each other? But as the weeks passed, Elena began to understand that Victor was wrong about something fundamental. Immortality was not a curse that required constant justification. It was simply another kind of existence, with its own rhythms and sorrows and small, private joys. She found herself teaching Victor how to live in the present moment, something he had forgotten 3 centuries ago. They sat by the fire and listened to rain. They hunted together, moving through the darkness as one predatory thought. They made love with the kind of tenderness that only comes when you know you have forever, and you finally stopped wasting it on regret. One night, Victor gave her a gift. It was a mirror, not the old silver one, but a new one, polished until it gleamed like water. But the reflection it showed was strange. In it, Elena could see not only herself as she was now, but also a shadow of who she had been. The woman drowning, the woman condemned, the woman who had wanted to die. And overlaid on that shadow was her current self, pale, powerful, alive in a way that transcended the old definitions. Every immortal sees themselves differently in every mirror, Victor explained. We can never quite believe we exist. But I thought you should see yourself the way I see you, as a woman who chose to survive, as someone who took the worst the world could do and transformed it into power. Elena stared at her reflection, and for the first time since her transformation, she wept. But the tears were not from sorrow. They were from a strange, overwhelming gratitude, not just for immortality, but for being seen, for being chosen, for being loved by someone who understood that some forms of salvation require drowning first. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For throwing yourself into the water after me, for teaching me that mercy can have teeth, for showing me that love, even immortal love, is still worth the risk." Victor pulled her close, and they stood before the mirror together. Two creatures born from death and hunger, looking at their own reflections as if they were miracles that might disappear if they blinked. Outside, the river sang its ancient song, and for the first time in 300 years, Victor believed that perhaps redemption wasn't a lie. Perhaps it was simply love, repeated enough times that even an immortal could finally learn to trust it. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. The cave transformed over the summer in ways that seemed to defy the passage of time itself. What had been a refuge became a sanctuary, and what had been a sanctuary began to feel like a world unto itself. Victor showed Elena hidden chambers that had been waiting for centuries, passages carved so deliberately and with such patience that Elena understood they could only have been the work of someone who had nothing but time and obsession. The first chamber was a library. Thousands of volumes lined stone shelves that had been hewn from the mountain itself, each stone polished until it gleamed like glass. Books in languages that Elena couldn't read filled the space. Greek, Latin, Old Church Slavonic, Arabic, Hebrew. Some were bound in leather so old it had turned to the color of dried blood. Others were wrapped in silk that had degraded to gossamer. The air itself smelled of paper and preservation, of knowledge guarded against the decay that claimed everything else. "I began collecting these in the 1400s, Victor explained, running his fingers along the spines. When I realized that memory alone was not enough, that if I didn't write things down, if I didn't preserve them in a form external to myself, then they would eventually be consumed by the centuries the way everything else is consumed." He pulled down a manuscript bound in leather so dark it was almost black. "This is medical text. I wrote it in Prague, before the plague, before I understood that disease was not a puzzle to be solved, but a landscape to be navigated." Elena opened the book carefully. The pages were filled with Victor's handwriting, precise, elegant, the script of someone trained in an era when penmanship was an art form. But what struck her most was the margin notes. Observations written in shaking hands, sometimes in different languages, sometimes in a cipher she didn't recognize. These were not just medical observations. They were prayers. They were accusations. They were the thoughts of a man arguing with himself across centuries. If God exists, why does he allow suffering? If God doesn't exist, then who should I blame for the children I couldn't save? I drank blood today. I am a murderer. I am also alive. These two facts are irreconcilable, and yet they coexist in my body like a parasite and a host. 300 years, still counting, still hoping that one day the counting will stop meaning something. Elena felt tears burn her eyes as she read. These were not the thoughts of a monster. They were the thoughts of a man who had been slowly drowning in his own consciousness, trying to use words as life rafts. The second chamber held something different. It was smaller, more intimate, and its walls were covered entirely in poetry. The words were written directly onto the stone in a substance that Victor explained was his own blood mixed with minerals and plant ash. Some of the writing was fresh enough that Elena could read it clearly. Some was so old that it had faded to barely visible ghost marks on the rock. I wrote these during the nights when memory threatened to crush me completely, Victor said quietly. During the centuries when I had no one to talk to. No one who would understand what it meant to exist outside of time. I would come here and write directly onto the stone, and somehow it felt like I was writing myself into existence. Like I was saying, Victor was here. Victor had thoughts. Victor mattered. Elena traced one of the fresher passages with her fingertips, reading the words aloud. She came to me like water comes to a drowning man, not as salvation, but as acknowledgement. She said, "You matter," and I believed her, because she was drowning too, and we chose to surface together. "You wrote this about me," Elena whispered. "I wrote it before I knew you," Victor corrected gently. "I wrote it as a prayer, as a hope that perhaps, in the infinite span of eternity, I might meet someone who understood that being broken doesn't make you less worthy of love. It makes you more honest." The third chamber was the deepest, and Victor approached it with a reverence that bordered on fear. The entrance was marked with symbols, carved so deeply into the stone that water still ran through them, as if the mountain itself was weeping. Inside, the walls were covered with names, hundreds of them, thousands. Names carved into stone, painted in pigment, written in faded ink. Each one a human being. Each one, Victor explained, someone he had loved or failed to save or killed in mercy or watched die despite his best efforts. "This is my confession," Victor said as they moved through the chamber. "This is my attempt to make sure that none of them are truly forgotten. That even if the world moves on, even if their families die and their stories are lost, at least their names will exist in this stone. At least somewhere, they will matter." Elena found herself overwhelmed by the weight of it all. This was not just a vampire's lair. This was a museum of mourning. This was a man's desperate attempt to transform guilt into something sacred. "How many?" she asked. "In 378 years?" Victor smiled sadly. "I stopped counting at 12,000. After that, the numbers became unbearable. I realized that if I could identify and mourn each one individually, I was still capable of being changed by their deaths. And if I couldn't, if they had begun to blur together into an abstract mass, then I had become the true monster, not a vampire, but something incapable of seeing the individual humanity in each life I had touched." They emerged from the chamber as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed obscene in their beauty. Elena felt fundamentally altered. She understood now that Victor had not been running from the world all these centuries. He had been running toward something, toward meaning, toward redemption, toward the possibility that an immortal creature could still believe that a single life mattered. That night, Victor brought her to a chamber she hadn't seen before. It was small, barely more than a closet carved from stone, but its interior was polished to a mirror shine. In the center, on a pedestal of pale marble, sat an ornate silver chalice. It was ancient, its surface engraved with symbols that seemed to shift in the candlelight. And beside it lay 2 daggers, their hilts wrapped in leather that was still soft despite the centuries. "I have been waiting for this moment," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for longer than I can calculate. I have wondered if such a moment would ever come. And now that you're here, now that you've chosen to stay, I need to ask you something that terrifies me more than any immortal has a right to be terrified." Elena's new heart began to race. "What? Will you bind yourself to me? Not through blood alone, that was only the beginning, but through ritual, through ceremony, through a promise that will echo across the centuries." He gestured to the daggers. "These were created in 1247, the year Margaret saved me. She carved them from bone and blessed them with wine mixed with holy water and blood. They were meant for this moment, for a ritual that would transform two separate immortals into something unified, something that carries the weight of one another's eternity." Elena picked up one of the daggers. It was lighter than she expected, and warm to the touch, as if it had been waiting for her hand. "What does the ritual involve?" "A binding of blood that is different from feeding," Victor explained. "We each cut our palms, and we hold the wounds together while speaking vows. The words are old, older than Christianity, older than civilization in some ways. They're a promise not to abandon each other, not to let the weight of immortality crush the other person, to carry each other's guilt and joy and memory with equal devotion." "And if I refuse?" Victor's smile was sad. "Then we continue as we are, still loving, still together, but incomplete in a way that I think only we would understand. Sometimes immortals need more than love, Elena. We need ceremony. We need ritual. We need the acknowledgement that what we feel is not just personal, but cosmic, that it matters to something bigger than ourselves." Elena extended her hand. "Then don't ask me to refuse." Victor took the dagger and made a precise cut across his palm. The wound opened like a mouth, and dark liquid, not quite blood, something older and thicker, welled up. Then he handed Elena the second dagger, and she made her own cut. Her blood was brighter, newer, but as it mingled with his in the silver chalice below, they became indistinguishable. They pressed their wounds together, palms meeting, and Victor began to speak in a language that Elena didn't recognize, but somehow understood in her bones. "By the blood that sustains us, I bind myself to you. By the centuries that we will traverse, I choose you. By the names I carry and the names you will carry, I acknowledge you as my eternal witness. By the mercy that saved me and the mercy that flows through you, I vow never to let you drown alone. You are the reason I survived. You are the reason I will continue to survive. In this life and in all the eternities that come after, I am yours, and you are mine." Elena's voice joined his, repeating the words, feeling them settle into her bones like truth. "By the blood that sustains us, I bind myself to you. By the centuries that we will traverse, I choose you. By the names I carry and the names you will carry, I acknowledge you as my eternal witness. By the mercy that saved me and the mercy that flows through you, I vow never to let you drown alone. You are the reason I will survive. You are the reason I will always choose to survive. In this life and in all the eternities that come after, I am yours, and you are mine." The moment they finished speaking, something shifted in the air of the cave. The candlelight seemed to come from inside their bodies rather than from external sources. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a faint luminescence. And Elena felt it, a connection so profound that it transcended the physical. Their heartbeats, though one was gone and one was new, seemed to synchronize. Their breathing fell into rhythm. Even their thoughts began to move in parallel, like dancers who had practiced the same steps for centuries. Victor looked at their joined hands, and his eyes widened. Where their palms pressed together, something was happening. The cuts were not closing, they were transforming. Silver threads were weaving through the wounds, creating patterns that looked almost like writing. Letters in languages Elena couldn't read, but that she somehow understood meant eternal, witnessed, chosen, redeemed. "What is it?" she whispered. "The binding," Victor said, awe clear in his voice. "It's marking us. The ritual was real, Elena. It was always real. I've just been the only one alive to perform it before this moment." He carefully unwound their hands, and Elena could see that the silver threads had faded, but they'd left marks, delicate scars that ran across both their palms like the paths of rivers seen from the sky. "So we're truly bound now?" Elena asked. "Body and soul and spirit and memory," Victor confirmed. "The ritual says that if one of us falls, the other will follow into whatever comes after, that we cannot be separated by time or distance or death itself, that we are no longer two immortals trying to navigate eternity alone. We are one eternal thing, fractured into two bodies but unified in purpose." Elena looked at the marks on their hands and understood that she had been forever changed by this moment. Not through hunger or blood drinking or supernatural transformation, but through choice, through ritual, through a man who had waited 378 years for the possibility of performing this ceremony. Outside, the stars had come out over the Carpathians, and in the cave, two creatures born from drowning held each other and felt, for the first time in their separate eternities, that they were not alone. The binding was complete. The ritual was sealed, and Elena finally understood what Victor had meant when he said that redemption tastes like blood and mercy. It tasted like this, like silver threads running through your wounds, like speaking vows that echo across centuries, like finally, believing that you were worth saving. Years passed, then decades, then the slow, inevitable accumulation of centuries. Elena found that time no longer moved in a linear fashion for her. It moved in spirals, each revolution bringing her back to the same moments, but from a different elevation, allowing her to see them from new angles, to understand them more deeply. She and Victor developed rituals of their own, separate from the binding ceremony, but equally sacred. Every spring, they would return to the river and stand exactly where he had pulled her from the water. They never spoke during these moments. Words seemed unnecessary. Instead, they simply held each other while the current rushed past them, carrying the memory of her drowning, transforming it into something that had become sacred through repetition and love. Every winter solstice, they would travel to the Chamber of Names and add new ones. Sometimes they were names of people they had helped. Sometimes they were names of people they had been forced to kill. Sometimes they were the names of humans they had loved from a distance, watched from the shadows as they lived brief, bright lives and then faded away. Victor was teaching Elena the strange mathematics of immortality, how to honor the dead without being crushed by their weight, how to love mortals without being destroyed by their inevitable departure. Centuries accumulated like snow. Elena watched as the world beyond the mountains transformed completely. The village of Vidra grew for a time and then began to shrink as progress pulled people toward larger cities. The river changed its course slightly, responding to geological shifts that no human lifetime could perceive. The forest itself seemed to age, the ancient trees dying and being replaced by younger growth, generation after generation. But the cave remained constant. The stones remembered. The names carved into the chamber walls remained legible, despite centuries of exposure to moisture and mineral-rich water. And Victor and Elena moved through the years like dancers who had finally learned each other's steps so completely that they could move in perfect synchronization without thinking. It was in the 23rd century of their existence together that Elena began to notice the change in Victor. At first it was subtle, a lightness in his gaze, as if he was seeing through the world rather than at it. His hand would sometimes rest on her shoulder or her cheek with a tenderness that seemed almost fragile, as if he was afraid she might break. And occasionally, late at night when he thought she was sleeping, she would find him standing before the silver mirror, simply looking at his own reflection without expression or judgment. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him one such night, coming up behind him and wrapping her arms around his waist. Victor leaned back into her embrace, and his voice came out soft, almost wondering. "I'm thinking about how strange it is that I can no longer remember what guilt feels like. I know I used to experience it. I have entire chambers of evidence that I was once a creature drowning in remorse. But now, when I look at those texts, when I read the poetry I carved into the stone, it's like looking at someone else's memories, like reading about a man I used to know but have become too different to fully understand. Is that a bad thing? Elena asked gently. I don't know, Victor admitted. I spent 300 years believing that my guilt was the price I had to pay for immortality, that if I ever stopped feeling it, I would become truly monstrous. But you... He turned to face her, and Elena saw tears on his cheeks. You've shown me that guilt and love are not eternal necessities, that they're just steps in a longer journey, that eventually you reach a place where you can remember the person you were without having to be them anymore. This realization seemed to transform Victor in fundamental ways. He became less introspective and more present. He stopped spending entire evenings reading his own journals and instead spent them watching Elena move through the cave, or listening to her voice as she read poetry aloud, or simply existing in the same space with the kind of comfortable silence that only comes after centuries of knowing someone completely. But it was also around this time that Elena began to understand something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The binding ritual, Victor explained during one of their rare philosophical discussions, didn't just connect them spiritually. It had begun to synchronize their immortality as well, which meant that they would age together, not physically, but spiritually. That as Victor's guilt lifted, hers would lift too. That as his memories began to fade into abstraction, hers would follow. That eventually, possibly, they might reach a point where the weight of all the centuries became light enough that they could choose to set it down. Are you talking about death? Elena asked. No, Victor said carefully. Immortals can't truly die unless they're killed or choose to walk into sunlight. But there are forms of transformation that exist in the space between life and death. There are whispers, among those of us who are truly ancient, of immortals who have lived so long and loved so deeply that they've learned to let go, to transform into something else entirely, to become memory instead of flesh. Elena found herself both drawn to and terrified by this concept. Would you choose that? Not unless you did, Victor said immediately. The binding means we're tethered to each other's choices now. If you chose to remain physical forever, I would remain with you. And if, eventually, you decided that eternity had given you everything it could, and you were ready for whatever comes next, then I would follow you there too. This conversation haunted Elena, but in a good way. It made her acutely aware of how much she treasured each moment with Victor. It made her more deliberate about where she directed her attention and her love. And it began to prepare her for a possibility that she had never truly considered, that immortality was not meant to be forever, that it was meant to be a particular shape of time, lasting long enough to learn what could only be learned across centuries, and then transforming into something else when the lessons were complete. But that moment had not yet arrived. It would not arrive for another 1,000 years or more, if the old vampire legends were true. So Elena chose to focus on the present, on the warmth of Victor's hand, on the sound of his breathing, on the way the candlelight played across his face when he slept. It was a night near the end of the 2300s when Elena ventured alone to the Chamber of Names. She wanted to add a name, the name of a woman they had helped 3 centuries ago, a woman who had been hunted by her own village for witchcraft, always this, Elena thought with bitter irony, and whom they had guided to safety in a distant city. That woman had lived a full life and died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by children and grandchildren who never knew what their ancestor truly was or what she had survived. As Elena carved the name into the stone, she heard something she had never heard before in the cave. A sound like singing, but not quite. More like the stones themselves were humming. She turned to find Victor standing in the chamber entrance, and his voice was adding to the hum, creating harmonies that seemed to echo through the mountain. "What are you doing?" she asked, singing them awake, Victor said. He gestured to the names surrounding them. The binding ritual doesn't just connect us to each other. It connects us to everyone whose name is inscribed here. Can you feel them? Elena closed her eyes and reached out with her new senses. And yes, there it was. A faint pressure, like thousands of hands laid gently against her consciousness. The accumulated weight of all the people Victor had carried in his memory for centuries. And now, through the binding, she carried them too. They're at peace, Victor said softly. For the first time in all the centuries I've been keeping their names alive in my guilt, they're actually at peace. Because I've finally let go of the idea that I should have saved them all. Because I've finally accepted that sometimes mercy means acknowledging when something is beyond saving and honoring it anyway. Elena opened her eyes and looked at the man she loved. His face had changed over the centuries, not physically, but something in his expression had shifted. The tension that had always lived around his eyes had softened. The set of his shoulders, which had carried such invisible weight for so long, had relaxed. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, free. "I love you," she said, and the words seemed inadequate to contain everything she meant. "I love you for saving me. I love you for teaching me. I love you for carrying all these names, and I love you for finally letting yourself rest." "I love you too," Victor replied. And then he pulled her close and danced with her in that chamber of names, moving to music that only immortals could hear, celebrating the moment when burden transforms into grace. They emerged from the cave as dawn was breaking over the Carpathians. The world had changed so much that the village of Vidra was now barely a memory. The ruins had been swallowed by forest, and trees grew through what had once been houses. The river still flowed, but its course had shifted, and the stones that had been at the surface when Victor had pulled Elena from the water were now buried deep, polished smooth by centuries of current. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked as they stood on the cliff overlooking the transformed landscape. "Saving me." Victor's answer was immediate and certain. Never. Not for a single moment. Not across all the centuries that have passed since that night. You were drowning, and I chose to drown with you. That choice was the first truly redemptive thing I had done in 300 years, and it has continued to redeem me every single day since. He took her hand, and Elena could see the silver scars from the binding ritual still visible in both their palms, not faded with time, but actually becoming more luminous, like they were absorbing light from the sun and storing it, ready to glow in the darkness. "The river keeps its secrets," Elena said, looking down at the water that had once tried to claim her. "It does," Victor agreed. "But our secret isn't a tragedy, it's a love story. And I think, for the first time since before I was turned, I'm going to stop feeling guilty about that. I'm going to accept that happiness is not a betrayal of those we've lost. Happiness is the only way to truly honor them, by proving that survival is possible, that love is worth the cost, that even immortals can learn to live instead of just endure." They stood together on the cliff as the sun rose higher, painting the mountains in gold and crimson. And somewhere in the distance, the river sang its ancient song, a song of drowning and resurrection, of darkness and light, of two creatures who had chosen each other and learned that forever was not a curse, but a gift. Elena had asked for death, and death had sent her something far worse, someone who refused to let her die. And in the 300 years since, she had learned that this was not a curse at all. This was salvation. This was the whole point of immortality. Not endless years, but endless moments. Not the quantity of time, but the quality of love that filled it. And so they returned to their cave, to their stones and their names and their rituals. But now they carried with them the understanding that all of this, the centuries, the guilt, the transformation, the binding, had been leading to this single moment of acceptance. This moment when an ancient vampire and a woman he had pulled from drowning could stand together in the morning light and finally, completely, believe that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned.